February 2005. A television station in Wichita, Kansas, received a padded envelope. Inside was a purple floppy disk. It appeared completely ordinary, outdated technology, even for the time. But investigators believed the person who had sent it was responsible for a series of murders stretching back more than 30 years. For decades, police had searched for him. He had disappeared for years, then returned to taunt investigators through letters, packages, and messages to the media. He believed he had remained anonymous. He believed the police still couldn't find him, and before sending the disk, he wanted to know whether police could trace it. Investigators communicated that it would be safe. He believed them. That decision would help investigators finally expose his identity. His name was Dennis Rader, but for decades, the public knew him by 3 letters: BTK. Dennis Lynn Rader was born in 1945 and grew up in Kansas. From the outside, his adult life appeared remarkably ordinary. He served in the United States Air Force. He married, raised children, worked regular jobs. Later, he became heavily involved with his local church. He eventually served as president of its congregation council. To many people around him, he appeared to be another suburban husband and father. Almost no one imagined that behind this ordinary identity was the man investigators had been hunting for decades. The crimes associated with BTK began in January 1974. The first known victims were members of the Otero family: Joseph Otero, Julie Otero, Josephine Otero, and Joseph Otero Jr. 4 members of one family were killed inside their Wichita home. The crime shocked investigators. At first, there was little reason to believe it marked the beginning of a decades-long series, but over time, other killings followed, and a pattern began to emerge. Later that same year, Catherine Bright was killed. Her brother Kevin was also attacked, but survived. His survival meant investigators had something incredibly important: a living witness. Then, in 1977, Shirley Vian was murdered inside her home. Later that year, Nancy Fox was killed. The crimes occurred around Wichita, and investigators increasingly believed they were dealing with the same offender. But something made this killer different. He wanted attention. He began communicating with police and the media. In October 1974, a letter connected to the Otero murders was discovered. The writer described details of the crime, details that convinced investigators the author possessed information unavailable to the general public. Then, he gave himself a name: 3 letters, representing 3 words: bind, torture, kill, BTK. The communications transformed the investigation. This wasn't simply someone attempting to avoid capture. The killer wanted police to know he existed. He wanted newspapers to write about him. He wanted people to be afraid. In one communication, he complained that he wasn't receiving enough publicity. He referenced other notorious killers, and he appeared frustrated that the media wasn't giving him the recognition he believed he deserved. That desire for attention became one of the most important characteristics investigators understood about him, and decades later, it would become the weakness that finally exposed him. Then, BTK seemed to disappear. Years passed. Wichita changed. Investigators retired. Technology advanced. Children who had grown up hearing warnings about BTK became adults. For many people, the killer became almost a piece of Wichita's dark history. Perhaps he had died. Perhaps he had moved away. Perhaps he had been imprisoned for another crime. Or perhaps he had simply stopped. But he hadn't disappeared. Dennis Rader was still living in the Wichita area, still raising his family, still attending church, still moving through the community, without the people around him realizing who he really was. Then, in 2004, nearly 30 years after the Otero murders, BTK returned. Local media coverage had revisited the case. The possibility that BTK was dead, imprisoned, or simply gone was being discussed. Rader apparently wasn't finished. He began communicating again. Letters arrived, packages appeared, documents contained information connected to old crimes. The killer, who had successfully remained hidden for decades, was suddenly talking again. Investigators immediately recognized the opportunity. Every communication was a risk. Every envelope, every document, every message created another opportunity to identify him. And this time, police possessed something they hadn't had in 1974: modern forensic technology. BTK believed he had returned to play another game with investigators. What he didn't realize was that the rules had changed. By 2004, investigators knew BTK was communicating again. After decades of silence, the person behind one of Wichita's most notorious unsolved cases had resurfaced, and every new message offered police another opportunity, another envelope, another document, another clue, another chance for BTK to make a mistake. For years, Rader had apparently believed he was more intelligent than the investigators pursuing him. His communications suggested that he enjoyed controlling the conversation. He decided when to communicate. He decided what information to reveal, and he decided when to disappear again. But technology had changed dramatically since the 1970s. Investigators could now examine evidence in ways that hadn't been possible when the murders began. Computer forensics had developed. DNA analysis had transformed criminal investigations. Digital information could leave traces, even when a suspect believed those traces were gone. And eventually, Rader would hand investigators exactly the kind of evidence they needed. During his renewed communications, BTK asked police an extraordinary question. Could information stored on a floppy disk be traced? Investigators recognized the opportunity immediately. Through their public communication with BTK, they indicated that a floppy disk would be safe. It wasn't. In February 2005, a package arrived at Wichita television station KSAS-TV. Inside, investigators found the purple floppy disk. Computer forensic specialists examined it. They discovered metadata associated with a deleted Microsoft Word document, and buried inside that digital information were clues. One of them was the name Dennis. Another pointed investigators toward Christ Lutheran Church. Police searched the church's public information, and there, they found a familiar first name: Dennis Rader. He was president of the Church Congregation Council. Suddenly, investigators had a real person to examine: a name, an address, a history, a potential suspect. But investigators couldn't arrest someone simply because computer metadata contained his name. They needed stronger evidence, something capable of connecting Dennis Rader directly to BTK. Investigators began quietly examining his background. Rader lived in Park City, near Wichita. He was married. He had children. He worked as a compliance officer for the city. He was involved in his church. On the surface, he looked nothing like the mysterious figure Wichita had feared for decades. Police continued building their case. Investigators obtained a DNA sample associated with one of Rader's daughters through a medical procedure she had previously undergone. Authorities obtained access through legal process. Forensic specialists compared familial DNA information with biological evidence preserved from the BTK investigation. The results strongly supported investigators' suspicions. Dennis Rader was now their primary target. February 25, 2005. Rader left work and began driving home. He had no idea that investigators were waiting. Police vehicles moved in. Officers stopped his vehicle. Dennis Rader was taken into custody. After more than 30 years, the hunt for BTK was effectively over. But investigators still faced one enormous question. Would Rader admit what he had done? During questioning, Rader eventually began discussing the crimes. Investigators searched his home, his office, and other locations connected to him. They recovered an extensive collection of materials, documents, photographs, writings, and records connected to his private obsession with the crimes. The investigation also confirmed that the known murders extended beyond the victims whose cases had first terrified Wichita in the 1970s. Maureen Hedge was killed in 1985. Vicki Wegerle was killed in 1986. Dolores Davis became the final confirmed victim in 1991. 10 victims, across 17 years of confirmed killings, and a criminal investigation that stretched across more than 3 decades. Yet perhaps the most extraordinary part of the story was how it ended. Dennis Rader hadn't been identified because someone suddenly remembered his face. He wasn't exposed by an eyewitness emerging after 30 years, and investigators hadn't caught him during another attack. He had returned because he wanted attention. He communicated because he wanted recognition. He sent investigators information because he believed he could control them. And eventually, he sent them the digital clue that helped lead police directly to him. For decades, BTK had taunted investigators. In the end, his own need to be heard helped investigators finally give him a name. With Dennis Rader finally in custody, investigators began confronting him with evidence collected over more than 3 decades. For the families of the victims, the arrest brought something they had waited years to see: an answer to the question of who had committed these crimes. On February 28, 2005, Dennis Rader was formally charged with 10 counts of first-degree murder. The anonymous figure who had called himself BTK was anonymous. No longer. The revelation shocked people who had known him. Neighbors knew Rader as a husband and father. Members of his congregation knew him through church. Residents encountered him through his work as a municipal compliance officer. He had also previously worked for a home security company, all while hiding a history that stretched back to 1974. Then, on June 27, 2005, Rader appeared in court. Instead of proceeding toward a conventional murder trial, he pleaded guilty to all 10 murders: Joseph Otero, Julie Otero, Josephine Otero, Joseph Otero Jr., Catherine Bright, Shirley Vian, Nancy Fox, Maureen Hedge, Vicky Wegerly, Dolores Davis. 10 people whose families had spent years living with the consequences of his crimes. During the plea hearing, Rader described the killings to the court. He spoke in a detached, disturbingly matter-of-fact manner. His admissions established his responsibility for the 10 murders. But for many people listening, hearing how casually he discussed human lives was deeply disturbing. Prosecutors could not seek the death penalty. Kansas had no enforceable death penalty statute when the murders were committed. Instead, Rader faced multiple life sentences. In August 2005, the court sentenced Dennis Rader to 10 consecutive life sentences, a minimum of 175 years, before he could ever become eligible for parole. For all practical purposes, Dennis Rader would spend the rest of his life in prison. But the BTK case became important for another reason. It demonstrated how dramatically criminal investigations had changed during the years Rader remained unidentified. When the first murders occurred in 1974, personal computers didn't exist in ordinary homes. DNA profiling wasn't available to investigators. Digital forensic analysis didn't exist. By 2005, all of that had changed. Rader had successfully hidden from investigators, while the world around him transformed. But when he decided to communicate again, he entered a technological world he didn't fully understand. The floppy disk has therefore become one of the most famous details of the entire case. A tiny piece of outdated technology, containing information Rader apparently believed could not expose him. He was wrong. Investigators recovered metadata. They connected it to his church. They found the name Dennis. They investigated Rader. And DNA evidence strengthened the connection. Piece by piece, the identity of BTK collapsed. Yet technology alone didn't solve the case. Detectives had preserved evidence for decades. Investigators had maintained old case files. Different generations of law enforcement officers continued working the murders. And when Rader finally made his mistake, they were ready to exploit it. Today, the story of BTK is often remembered because of the letters, the codes, the floppy disk, and the extraordinary way he was identified. But those details can overshadow the most important part of the case: the victims. 10 people whose lives were taken, and families whose lives were permanently changed. Dennis Rader wanted people to remember 3 letters: BTK. He wanted recognition. He wanted attention. He wanted his chosen name to survive. But perhaps the better way to remember this case is through the people who never asked to become part of it. More than 30 years after the first murders, Dennis Rader was finally identified. Not because he stopped making mistakes, but because after decades of silence, he couldn't resist communicating again. He believed he was controlling the investigation. Instead, he gave investigators the clue that helped lead them straight to him. For decades, Wichita had asked one question: who is BTK? In 2005, they finally had their answer: Dennis Rader,